Greetings, people of Earth. I'm Rick Carroll. Thanks for watching my video and listening to my podcast. Yes, I wrote Windows. Of course, that's not Microsoft Windows. And this is a little bit of an example of how, as development and software goes, you repeat things a lot in terms of implementation. So any software developer out there will know that everybody's written a list class or a tree class or fill in the blank sorting class, and you've probably written dozens or hundreds of these things in different languages, either because the language didn't have the construct or it didn't suit your needs. And there's been a lot of work done in languages to try to make things more reusable and whatnot. But what does it mean I wrote Windows? Well, early on at InstallShield, the shield part of the name, which I talk about in another video, talked about abstracting platforms from customers. So if you wrote an installation or a demo or one of the other products that we had, you could write it for Windows. It would work on Windows and OS2 and other platforms as they came along. And you wouldn't have to worry about the differences. And that included versioning and all that kind of stuff, so that you didn't have to write specific things for platforms. So we shielded you from that. Early on, when Windows 3 came out, not everybody jumped on the bandwagon for that. And in fact, for years, because software's slow, people still use DOS for whatever reason, because it had legacy programs or organizations can't change that quickly. So our customers still had a need for DOS installation. And I'm not going to go into a whole DOS installation discussion, but it was not good. It was a very complicated command line and people didn't like it. It stunk, right? But we had enough customers where we thought if we could create our product and have it run in DOS, maybe with some limitations, the shield would really win out. You'd have DOS, you'd have OS2, and you'd have Windows. And back then, OS2 was actually going to be the new operating system, right? Another story. But so in order to do that, and I was doing all the development at the time, I came up with the idea that if I would implement the API that we would link to normally for Windows, I could then fool our code into thinking it's running on Windows. So you ask how big a screen is, I give you certain dimensions. You call for a line to be drawn or a box or a button. The dialog units that were used for measurement could be abstracted. And you had a screen which is 80 by 24 character boxes. So that's what I did. So it was around 300 functions. I don't remember the specifics now. There were some that didn't work, like it just didn't map because DOS is limited. The other problem was DOS still had the 640K memory limit. So people who lived during that time had to figure out how to get around that. So that was another part of the problem, is I had to limit that. I also had to have our script installer engine run just as it would under Windows. So luckily our code at the time was C and C++. C++ was relatively new. So I ended up writing Windows for DOS. Now, that's interesting. Is it something we should have done? No. It's easy to say that now. I think we sold 2 copies of that. But at the time, it seemed like, oh my gosh, if we could get these DOS people over, because there was a big sales problems that they couldn't use the product. They had this DOS, they had installation under DOS, not necessarily a DOS installer. And we could eliminate that as a barrier to buying the product, right? And when you're a startup, you're pretty hungry and you try to do lots of things. So effectively, I ended up writing Windows in a limited form, of course. And I had to make it so that our code, for the most part, didn't know the difference. Like with anything, I have a lot of fun with this stuff. It was a lot of work. A lot of the code got tossed out. Stuff happens. That didn't end there. I ended up writing Windows another 3 times. Now, not to the same extent, and just a short discussion about it. The next time I wrote it was with Digital Wizard for our internet play. So I have another discussion about where I talk about how we tried to get our internet play in the late 90s beyond installation so that we could go public and IPO and all that stuff. what you take commonplace today in Gmail and Google Maps and apps that are very responsive didn't exist in the 90s. Google hadn't really stumbled upon the asynchronous aspect of web functionality from an HTML page. So we tried to create a HTML-based development system, and I'll say me, to create the UI that was going to be replacing our Windows-based UI. Again, this would be cross-platform. Eventually, you could potentially host this. So in order to do that, because the technology still was new, and really the problem that really was back then was that JavaScript execution speed was just interpreted and so slow. There was no compile on demand or anything. So again, the constructs didn't exist, so we had to create a windowing system to implement this development user interface. This was a big team effort, and it was a challenge, and we ran into lots of problems, and we're probably too ahead of ourselves on that. Now today, everything's like that, and there's lots of reasons why you can, because the internet speeds infinitely fast now, and compile on demand and JavaScript and the support for these things is great now, right? But again, that was another experience. The next situation was at LifeShadow, where we created an environment based on the Web 2.0 platform. And again, this is before a lot of the tools and development stuff came out, but the asynchronous calls were there. A lot of support was there, but not for the UI. So again, we created a windowing environment. This wasn't as complicated. It was yet another version of it, not as big as the last two. And then we created a device about 5 years ago, which I'm not getting into details, but basically this device that had an LCD screen on it. And just from a comedy point of view, from my point of view, I'm like, oh my gosh, we need a windowing environment on this. Anybody that's done embedded development or on devices realizes, first of all these devices generally are different. Even if you have the same chipset or the same company, depending upon your LCD and how things are set up, there's no windowing environments out there for it specifically. Now, there are companies that'll sell you either source code or libraries, or they'll do the work. We kind of took a hybrid approach on this product, where we had a company do the base part, which would be the source package, to do the device drivers, the low-level stuff. But once again, we had to develop the windowing, the menus, the drawing, just putting JPEGs on the screen, and the management of all that through an API, which I modeled after Windows, but it wasn't meant to be an API equivalent. And this was simpler because it's on the device had certain functionality to it. And there were packages out there that do the whole thing, but they were very expensive, but also, or too heavy, right? That's another problem. Anytime you get in this embedded development, you can get too heavy of a package, and you got limited memory when you get to these devices. So it was actually kind of back to the DOS InstallShield days, where you've got limited memory, and you have to kind of work around the same problems we did 18 years ago, right? So I wrote Windows a couple of times. It was very interesting. And by the way, it's all kind of the same stuff with the Z buffering and the line drawing and anti-aliasing and all this stuff. But the first one, DOS InstallShield, definitely was Windows for DOS. So there you go. Thanks for listening. Ask any questions you want, and take it easy.